everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to those of us here in the room. Welcome to our friends and colleagues who are attending by Zoom. We're pleased to have you here for our 2022 gala. I'm Sonia Martin. I'm the chair of the society, and I wanted to take a moment to talk about this evening and why it's so important that you are here supporting the society and all that it does. Shortly, I will turn to the program over to Judge Hawkins. And I hope you were able to see some of the sneak peek slides, which will be playing as well. So you know what kind of how moving and important the discussion is that awaits you. Tonight's program is emblematic of the work we do as a society, work that teaches about the important role of judges and the judiciary, and the work that even in challenging moments inspires us to be our best as members of the legal community and of the community at large. To understand this, you need to look no further than our programming, which runs the gamut from topics like first women in the law, voting rights, the demonization of immigrants and the right to travel, and about Paul Murray, perhaps the most influential legal strategist you've ever heard of, never heard of. You can find these programs, our journal on Western legal history, and our oral histories, including a brand new one from Judges Susan Oki-Malwe, Leslie Kobayashi, and Jill Otake, in a conversation with our board member Claire Wan Black and my partner about Judge Malwe's new book about the first 15 Asian American women, Article 3 judges, and that is available on our website. Your support is so essential to all that we do, and we don't take that for granted. But so that we can get to the program so quickly, I'm going to hand this over to Judge Hawkins. At the end of the program, our wonderful executive director, an amazing executive director, Robin Lipsky, will thank all of our sponsors and let you know how each of you can do more to support the society and all of the important work that we do. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Judge Hawkins to start our program. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to see everyone, old friends, new friends. Mylan Smith, who talked me into my current job without me even knowing about it. Andrea Orden, a dear friend. We were U.S. attorneys together a long time ago, sitting right there by my wife, Phyllis. About a year ago, as I was watching the 3.5 million or so Ukrainians fleeing their country because of the Russian invasion of their homeland, it occurred to me that armed conflict and the threat of armed conflict can produce refugees far and wide. And it can also, perhaps at the end of the day, send us really remarkable people with remarkable stories. So I borrowed from Robert Heinlein's classic science fiction book, Stranger in a Strange Land. The title of our just released historical journal is called Strangers in a Strange Land. Now we're going to tell the stories, and I'm going to interview some of the people involved. And I'm going to start with my friend Carlos Bea, because he's the oldest and we do respect to our elderly, but I'm also going to do this chronologically because he pops up first because of his story. So what was your knock on the door? What made you leave the beaches of Biarritz?
Well, before I say anything in answer to that, I want to congratulate all you in attendance here, because it's obvious that you're lawyers and former law students, because no one's in the front row where they can be called. But in answer to the question, we were in Biarritz at the end of the Spanish Civil War. My family had been in San Sebastian during the Civil War. There was no fighting in San Sebastian that affected us anyway. And I remember playing at the beach in Biarritz, and I was told by my mother that we had to pack and leave immediately and go back to Spain because the Germans had invaded Poland. And the German army, who had been present in the Spanish Civil War and had been observed by anybody who was looking, would probably eat the French in 6 weeks. And she was absolutely correct. And so we packed up immediately and went to our house in San Sebastian, which was right across the border from Biarritz. And she was very concerned with the Germans invading not only France, but also Spain. And she said that it would be probably better to make a visit to the country where her mother was born and where my father was born, which was Cuba. And so we got on a ship in Lisbon, Portuguese ship, very slow, not so hot. And it took us about 2 weeks to get from Lisbon to Havana. On that trip, I remember that we were required to wear our life jackets at all times, including in bed, because of the possibility of German submarines. And that was every now and then somebody would yell out that they saw a submarine and everybody would run around and go to their lifeboats. And some of those yells were from a couple of Spanish kids who were kind of bored. And then we got to Havana. So that's how we left Europe.
Now, eventually you got to Miami, right?
Got
To Miami at some point?
Yep.
And
My
your
mother-
mother thought that everyone there would speak Spanish, but they didn't.
My mother was schooled in a convent in Granada. And so when she got to Havana, she was quite surprised to learn that it was hot there and that there were mosquitoes. And she said, maybe we should go to the United States. And that in those days, we had Cuban nationality because my father had opted for Cuban nationality. And we got into Miami very easily because there was Western Hemisphere preference in those days. And when we got to Miami, mother learned to her surprise that not everybody spoke Spanish in Florida. But she thought, well, but in
She was ahead of her time.
she was, yes, she waited, it would have changed. But then she said, well, if the cities in California are named Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Fresno, and Sacramento, everybody speaks Spanish there. So she went to a used car lot and bought a 1938 Buick and piled us into the car, and we started driving west. No freeways in those days, and took us about a month in different motor camps until we got to Southern California, which was marvelous. Orange groves, no freeways, no smog. It was terrific, and we loved it.
Good. Now, you wound up schooling there. In fact, you went to the same high school that Steve Reinhardt and Ray Fisher, our late colleagues on the Ninth Circuit.
Yeah, I went to grammar school there, and I had a brief stay in a school in San Jose. Thank goodness it was very brief. And then I went back to high school in University High School in West Los Angeles, which was where Ray Fisher and Steve Reinhardt before me and Ray Fisher after me had gone to school there.
You wound up at Stanford.
Well, I was playing basketball in those days, and I had a pretty good season in JC, at Menlo JC. So I went around to the different schools to see about getting into different schools. And I ended up at Stanford. And I had been recruited by UCLA, by Johnny Wooden, to go play at UCLA. And when I went to Stanford, the Stanford coach said to me, you really ought to come to Stanford instead of go to UCLA. And I said, why? You know, UCLA's got a better team and Wooden's a great coach and all this. And he said, yeah, well, there's two reasons you ought to go to Stanford. One, you'll get a better education if you go to Stanford than if you go to UCLA. But secondly, you'll probably play more here than at UCLA.
Now, we're now winding up to about 1952. You're still playing basketball, and Olympic basketball teams are being assembled. And the I think the 1952 American squad had people like Bill Russell. And
Well, what happened is that my brother made a trip to visit our uncle who was living in Havana. And when he came back, he said, you know, you ought to try out for the Cuban Olympic basketball team. It hadn't occurred to me. And so I'd had a pretty good season at Menlo, so I had some clippings and I put them all together and mailed them to the head basketball coaches at the Cuban Olympic team. And I said, well, how can I try out? And I got back a letter that said, you don't have to try out, you're on the team.
you just did try out. So you played in the Olympics. I take it no medals were won by the Cuban team.
Say it again.
No medals were won by the Cuban team.
No, frankly, I always consider myself an Olympic tourist because our team went 2-5, all right, which isn't a great record. Later, my wife and I had a son named Sebastian who rode for the United States and won a silver medal in Sydney. So he's the Olympic athlete of the family. I'm the Olympic tourist.
So it came time to go back to Stanford. And
With a short stop.
yes, where'd you stop?
Because after the games, I went down to Spain to see some of my relatives. And my uncle said, you really haven't learned Spanish very well. And you really ought to stay in Spain and polish up your Spanish. And I was 2 years ahead of my class. So it made some sense. And then I signed up with a Spanish national champion, Real Madrid, and I played for them for a year. And that was a lot of fun, although the playing conditions were very heroic in those days. We played on concrete floors, if you were lucky, in high-life frontons. We played on gravel. And there was only one wooden basketball floor in all of Spain, and that was in the bull ring of Barcelona, which sounds grand, except the fans there didn't like the people from Madrid, so they used to throw things at us, and, like bottles, right?
So eventually you got back to California and to Stanford. And then what happened?
Well, I played at Stanford for 2 years, and then I got into law school, and I played my last year of eligibility in my first year of law school, because in those days you could do 3 years of undergraduate at Stanford and go to law school and get credit for your 4th year of undergraduate and your 1st year of law school, which was saved you a year. And so that's what I was playing. And then I decided I'd like to become an American citizen. But it wasn't so easy, because it turned out that I had ended my residency from 1943 to 52 by going to the games and coming back with a student visa, and that was a non-resident visa. So the immigration authorities started a deportation proceeding, and I had a hearing, and I presented evidence, and I lost. And then we took an appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeal. But there I got really lucky, because the chief judge of the Board of Immigration Appeal, a sainted man named Thomas Finucane, at the end of the oral argument leaned across and asked my attorney whether he could ask me some questions. And this is an appellate court, right? And I can imagine how my attorney felt at the time. He can't very well say no. He doesn't know what's coming, and he hasn't prepared me, but he's got to say yes, right? So he says, sure, yes. And the chief of the Board of Immigration Appeals said, what position did you play at Stanford? And I told him I played forward and then center. And he said, did you ever get recruited by Johnny Wooden? I said, oh yeah, but I didn't go to UCLA for the reason that I told you. And as we left, my attorney turned to me and he said, that fellow ain't going to deport you.
So the first time that Carlos and I sat together on a panel of the Ninth Circuit, lo and behold, it was an immigration case, and a young lawyer from DOJ steps up to the podium, and I said, before you start, I just want you to know that your organization tried to deport Judge Bea at one time. And the lawyer was completely flummoxed, and she said, "I apologize." She kept calling him Judge B, I guess after Aunt B on the television show, but she settled into her argument, and Carlos and I ruled for the government. All right, so that's his stranger in a strange land. He wanted America, he wanted to be here, and they wanted to oust him out, at least ostensibly. So now the next one in sort of chronological order with us by Zoom is Roger Benitez, who's the senior district judge in the Southern District of California. And
thank you for
Roger,
inviting me. I've been enjoying Judge Bea's story. I should tell Judge Bea that the reason why you didn't have to try out is because my mom was 5'1", my dad was 5'6", and they both tell me that they were basketball stars in high school.
So Roger, you were born and spent your early years in Cuba. And when did the knock come on your door?
The knock, well, the first knock, as you probably read in my story, came on, I think it was sometime around April or May of 1959. But the story doesn't really begin there. The story begins on December 31 of 1958. I remember that night vividly. My mother loved to dance. My dad did not, but they had a deal, and the deal was that they would go out at least once a year, and that was for New Year's Eve. And they went out to dance. I believe it was the Hotel Nacional in Havana. And that celebration ended early because they were told that the rebel troops were marching into Havana, and everybody made a beeline for the door, including my parents. So somewhere along the line, we then saw what was happening with a new regime.
I'm conjuring up visions of Godfather 2.
Could be, it very well could be. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a beautiful hotel. It's actually a twin of the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach. If you've been there, the two hotels are basically identical. So as it turned out, because of the repression of the regime, it quickly became apparent that to my parents that something had to happen. Sadly, somewhere along the line, my parents divorced. There was some financial hardship that arose, at least in part as a result of my dad losing his business, and other things that families encounter. So at some point in time, my mother decided that she had to, because my mother had custody of the two boys, she decided that she would try to get us out of Cuba and get us to the United States. So, which by the way, I might add, you notice that my name is rather odd. Roger is not a really common name, but it was a name my parents had always intended to send me to the United States at some point in time, probably in my college career. So my mother started looking for ways to get out of the country, but she could not get out. She could not get out because they were not allowing professionals to leave the country. They were afraid of something called brain drain. So something that happened, which I think was probably the major catalyst to having us leave the country, was I attended a really, really good private school called Colegio de la Luz. Colegio de la Luz was closed down at one point in time. I remember our bus driving up to the beautiful wrought iron gates, and the wrought iron gates were chained, and padlocked. And so the bus had to turn around and take us home. The director of that school, a gentleman by the name of Gil Bertrand, was arrested. And we were then made to attend public school. Now, I can tell you that public school there was nothing like public school here in the United States. Immediately upon entering the classroom, we were told that it was our obligation, our responsibility to turn our parents in and to turn anyone else in who spoke ill of the regime or of Fidel Castro. And I think that was a catalyst. That was what motivated my mother to say, I've got to get my kids out of here. This just can't be. And that's how we became introduced to Operation Peter Pan, which, as you saw in my story, was, and that was what we originally talked about my story being about, Michael. And so that's it.
So how old were you when you left Cuba? You
I-
and your brother?
I was 10. My brother was 12, just about to turn 13. And it was a bit of a harrowing experience.
You were
Before
leaving your mother.
we were leaving my mother, and we had no idea if we would ever see her again, because we didn't know if she would ever be able to get out. Now, in order to leave, we had to walk through an area or a room. It was called the pecera, which translates into fishbowl. It was an all glass room. I believe there's a documentary, by the way. I think it's called Escape from Havana, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's on NPR. That in fact shows that room. But as we kids, those of us who were allowed to leave, as we walked through that room, we were then forced to answer certain questions. We were told, asked about what we were taking out. We were allowed to take out essentially you can think of a litigation briefcase. That's about what we were allowed to take out. And I was allowed to take out my hypoallergenic pillow because I was allergic to down and feathers when I was a little kid. So I was allowed to take that pillow out. And then my brother and I marched through that fishbowl and walked out into the tarmac, walked up the stairs up to the Pan Am. I believe it was a Constellation, because I'm pretty familiar with airplanes. And although I was 10 years old, my recollection is that it was a Constellation, but I've tried to look it up and I cannot find and verify that that Pan Am flew a Constellation down to Havana, but I think it did. And so eventually we left, landed in Miami International. My uncle Rosendo, my aunt Marta, and my cousin Martika, who had fled 6 months earlier, because my uncle was a performer, director, writer, composer, quite the he was sort of the if you can think of the Marlboro Man, he was that man for a beer called Cristal. So he was very well known, and they wanted him to do a commercial, including my little cousin, that would be favorable to communism and to the Russian regime. My uncle did not want to do that. Unfortunately, he happened to have a friend, and the friend was the manager of the airport in Havana, who somehow or another managed to be able to get them out that very same weekend. They flew to Miami. And just sort of an aside, if I can tell you this, my uncle, who was a very, very successful man, you can actually look him up online. You'll see lots of materials on him. My uncle came to the United States, and he earned a living when he first came to the United States by going door to door, knocking on doors, selling coffee, until he was able to get himself on his hands on an Underwood typewriter. And he began to write a column for Diario de las Americas, which is a very well-known Hispanic newspaper in Florida.
At some point, your mother was able to join you. Tell them the story about how your mother got out of Cuba.
My mother was a really smart lady. As you may know, we were able to get out because even though my mom and dad were going through a divorce, my dad's brother, Pedro, who had come to the United States many years earlier because he had married a performer, a US citizen, he was able to contact the State Department in the US and request a waiver of a visa. So my dad's brother was instrumental in getting that waiver of that visa. And I think if you look at the article, you'll actually see the original documents that I was able to find. So it appeared that it was my dad that had taken my brother and I out of the US. And what my mom did was that she was able to convince the Cuban authorities that she was going to come to the United States and retrieve her two boys and take them back so that they could become revolutionaries. But as you can imagine, when the airplane landed at Miami International, she had a sudden change of heart and she decided that she would stay here.
It's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing it with us, Judge.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So now in terms of the chronology of the stories, there's someone who can't be here tonight, and that's our colleague Wally Tashima, who when he was almost 8 years old, was swept up in the Japanese-American relocation effort in following Pearl Harbor and the sort of xenophobia that followed that, and taken, of all places, to Arizona, Poston, Arizona, right on the Colorado River. His story is intriguing. It's interesting. He became quite a swimmer. They were allowed to swim in the Colorado River. And one day he decided, I'm just going to swim over to California. So he swam over, he swims back, and he comes back, and his mom says, where have you been? And he said, I've been to California. After the end of World War II, in the early 50s, he joined the United States Marine Corps and served in Korea with distinction. Read his story. I'm very sorry he can't be with us tonight. So next in our chronology is the American involvement in Vietnam. And we have my colleague, our colleague, Jaqueline Nguyen, who's been a U.S. District Judge in the Central District, before that a Superior Court Judge, and is now on the circuit, and 10 years on the circuit. So tell us how the knock came on your door.
My knock on the door began when I was a couple of months shy of turning 10 years old. The invasion of South Vietnam by Northern Communist forces had started in March of 1975, and the cities were falling pretty rapidly one by one until the fighting got pretty close to my city of Dalat, which is in the central highlands of Vietnam. Now, my dad's a military man. He's an officer in the South Vietnam Army. And he was worried that we would be killed in the crossfire. So the question is where to send us. He decided that the safest place at that point was to basically try to get us to the capital of Saigon, because that was going to be the last line of defense. And, you know, based on his military contacts, he knew that the South Vietnam government was starting to, the military was starting to shore up most of its resources to defend the capital, but he didn't have anybody to take us. And there was no commercial flights or any means of getting us out of Dalat. So the fighting was still going on in Dalat, and he knew that occasionally supply planes would land and they would take off. But given the shelling and the fighting going on, it would land, there would be moments to be unloaded and loading again, and then they would take off to the capital. So each morning, and we hadn't gone to school for, at that point, at least a few weeks. So each morning, my mom would dress us in several layers, just in case that's the day that a plane would be available. One morning, as we were having breakfast, my dad sent his driver home and said, that's it, load all the kids up. My mom wasn't home. We didn't know what was going on, but we were loaded up to the Jeep and driven to the airport in Dalat and taken to a side fence where we were thrown over one by one. My four siblings and I, the five of us, my youngest brother was still a baby, so he didn't get thrown over the fence, but we were thrown over and taken to the plane and going to the capital of Saigon, where we stayed with a family that we didn't know. Well, as it turned out, my parents had made an arrangement for a young university student who became friendly with my mom. She was from Saigon and her family had no way to get her home to the capital. And so my dad said, well, come stay with us at the house. When I can get my kids out, I'll bring you along. But in exchange, you got to take all these kids with you. So, you know, here she is. I think she was like in her second year of college at the time. Just in case, my dad had made us all these mini military dog tags that we wore, which I still have to this day as memento. We each wore a military dog tag just in case she lost one of us. And then she took us to her parents' house. They were so happy to see us. We stayed there, and my parents eventually made their way down to Saigon and found us. But for a while there, we didn't know if we would see my parents, nor did they know whether they would ever see us again. Eventually, we all gathered after Dalat was lost. We gathered in Saigon. And once again, the fighting was approaching the capital. And when it looked pretty bleak, my father was looking around for an opportunity to basically flee the country altogether. He had actually in his military career worked very closely with the Americans, including American intelligence. He'd been sent to the United States a couple of times, once during the 60s and the late 60s, both trips to do military police training and the like. So he had some American contacts. He reached out to them and said, you've got to help me get my family out. And at that time—
How did you get to the airport? You had to get to the airport to get on a plane.
Right.
How did you get in?
Well, it was purely by coincidence. And as my dad tells the story, but for a thief and a stolen watch, we would not have had the opportunity to flee. His American contacts offered to take him out, but they couldn't take the whole family. It was just too many of us. We were a family of 8. And so my dad said, well, all my kids are under 10 years old. How's my wife going to be able to raise them without me? So he declined that offer. One day he was riding on a motorcycle with my mom in the back. This was at 6:30 in the morning. And as he was driving down the street, a thief came by and just snatched his wristwatch right off of his wrist. Now, in the chaos of war, you would think he would let it go. It was not an expensive watch, but he was determined to give chase. So he chased the thief down all the narrow streets of Saigon until he finally lost the thief and realized that he was next to the home of, there's an American civilian that he knows. His name's Bill Miner. Bill Miner at that time was married to a Vietnamese woman, had a Vietnamese family. So Bill Miner has priority to be airlifted out of Vietnam. So Bill Miner had said, well, I'll see what I can do, but no definite promises were given. Well, my dad was right in front of Bill Miner's mother-in-law's house. So he stopped by for tea. And as they were about to come into the house, the phone rang. This was one of the few homes in Saigon with a telephone. The phone rang and it was Bill Miner on the phone. And so the mother-in-law said, I've got the Nguyen's here. Ben's here with his wife. And Bill Miner's like, I'm at the airport already. It's a secured airport guarded by NPs at the time. I'm going to help him. If he can go home and gather all the kids and get to the airport, I'm going to try to get them in. So I think the plan from the American government was an orderly airlift of American civilians. It didn't happen that way. You know, that you were supposed to get on a list, and if you were on the list, they would check your name. But in the end, it was, you're American, get on in, who's your family? So Bill Miner got us into the secure airport.
He said, this is my family.
This is my family. You know, his wife, she had a whole bunch of, I think, maybe 4 or 5 kids. We had 6 children, my mom, and then he brought another family. So Bill Miner rescued 3 families, got us in the secure airport where we waited one night, and, you know, the planes landed when they could, and we loaded up and then would take off. So we went to the Philippines and then Guam and then to Camp Pendleton.
Where the Marines took care of you.
Yes, yes. At that Marines base, they set up a temporary refugee camp. And so I remember one of the first things, we slept in tents and on army cots. So at night it got very cold and we all got army issued jackets, which came down to my knees at the time, which I still have to this day as well.
It's a wonderful story. Another in the series that's in the current issue is about Chief Judge Miranda Dew in Nevada, who couldn't be with us tonight, who has a story about exiting Vietnam. It's a bit different. They use the excuse of getting out because her father was of Chinese extraction. And apparently the new revolutionary government did not want folks like that, or were happy to see them leave. So they assembled a bunch of people in a boat, I think it's around 200 people, and headed for Malaysia. And when they got within sight of the shore, it was the Malaysian authorities sent boats out and said, you can't land here. We don't want you here. And her father decided, well, we've got to do something. So he breached the boat, basically broke it apart so they could all swim to shore. The problem was Miranda couldn't swim, but she had an uncle who was quite a good swimmer. She climbed on his back. You can imagine this, those of you who swim. And it was about a mile to shore, and they got to shore and then went to Kuala Lumpur. And when they got to America, were sent to the deep south, where they went to through K through about 8 in segregated schools. She was the only non-African American in the schools. It's a fascinating story. Urge you to read it. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Right over there, Louise. The question, I think, Louise, correct me if I'm wrong, is what happened to the other children? What happened to the Peter Pan children who came to the United States and didn't have families to, like you did, to absorb them?
Many of them were sent to camps that were set up by Father Welsh. And they were then they found foster homes for them. A huge percentage, and as I sit here, I can't remember the percentage, but a huge percentage of the kids that came here were eventually reunited with some family member by, I believe it was 1966. So some of the kids, depending on what stage of Operation Peter Pan we're talking about, some of the kids were sent to private residences, some were sent to camps, and some of us came to be with our families. So, but I believe it was like 90% of the kids that came across an Operation Peter Pan wound up eventually with families by 1966.
What inspired you, and I'll include Judge Benitez in the question, to enter the law, to become judges?
Part of it was because I grew up like many immigrant kids, translating for my parents and seeing how the law functioned. We were all naturalized citizens under my parents when we were minors, with the exception of my brother. Somehow the files were missing his name. And my mom spent such time and effort trying to fix that by consulting with an attorney. She couldn't navigate the system. So one of us, usually it's one of the older kids, so myself and my sister would come along and help her translate. It still got completely and totally messed up. And so he ended up having to go through his own process after he reached the age of majority. But I saw a little preview when I was fairly young as to how the law could operate effectively, but how painful and stressful it could be if you couldn't navigate it properly. The other part of it was not really the law, but it's really public service. And that's something that my parents really embedded in us early, is really to try to give back to a country that has given us so much opportunity. So I think one of the proudest things that we were able to do for my parents is I went into public service. My sister, after she got her graduate degree, joined the military and served there for a few years. And that he couldn't be more proud of that, regardless of whatever else we achieved in our lives.
Carlos, you want to take a stab at that?
When I was 14, I was involved in some litigation. And I went into a lawyer's office and he was debriefing me about litigation, had to do with some trust issues. And he said, you know, you really ought to think about becoming a lawyer. And I asked him, why? He said, well, look, every time that door opens, a new life comes in and you learn about somebody new and all their problems and all their wishes and dreams, etc. And you make a pretty good living. It convinced me.
Roger, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I wish I had a great story to tell you, but here's my story. My grandfather, that is my mother's dad, was a magistrado and a solicitor before that. And I admired him because he was probably about as tall as Carlos. He was sort of an exception. He was a tall, wiry man that I loved dearly and I admired. Then when I was a little older, we came to the United States. I watched a lot of Perry Mason. And then after that, at some point in time, I took an aptitude test that, guess what, said that I could make a living being a lawyer. And then at one point in time, there was a Superior Court judge in the small town where I lived who was retiring. He called me and he said, Raj, I'm retiring. I'd like for you to run for my position. And that's how I started on my path to become a judge. So here I am, and that's my story.
And we're glad to have you. Are we about out of time? We need to wrap up. Our thanks to all of our participants and Roger on Zoom.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you all. I wanted to add my personal thanks to each of you for that wonderful panel and for that outstanding presentation. I'm Robin Lipsky, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the NJCHS. We're so thrilled to have you here tonight. And in a moment, I will introduce a dear friend of the NJCHS, Andrew Evans of the Magic Patio. But first, since it truly does take a village to make an evening like this happen, I wanted to take a moment to thank all of the members of our village. And that includes the executive committee of our board, the Gala committee, the resource development committee, and each of our sponsors who deserve more than just a quick mention of their names. So please know that when I read your names, how much genuine appreciation is actually behind all of that. So to our diamond sponsors, Denton's and the Supreme Court Historical Society, platinum sponsors, Farrell, LeBron and Martell, Morrison and Forster, O'Melveny and Myers, Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich and Rosati Foundation. Gold sponsors, Gibson Dunn, KTBS Law, Sussman Godfrey. Our silver sponsors, Dury Tangri, Lighthouse Global eDiscovery, Pillsbury Law, Rosen Bean, Galvin and Grenfield, and Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. Our emerald sponsors, ADR Services, Aptus Court Reporting, Bartko, Zankel, Bunzel, Miller, Cades Shuddy. Did I get that right, Jeff? I know it's been 6 years and I'm still trying. Oh, yes. Woohoo. Now I can end happy. California Lawyers Association, Golden One Credit Union, Jones Legal Group, Larson, Snell, and Wilmer. Our Pearl sponsors, Planet Depots, our signature cocktail. You have to try that out. I think it's called the Amicus Curiae because after one or two, we'll all be friends. That's Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed. The desserts from Complex are sponsored by a Complex Appellate Litigation Group. And the magic this evening is sponsored by Corey Weber. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for your time, your support, and your attention, and encourage you to eat, drink, and be merry. Thank you so much for coming.